You smell it before you see it. Something is roasting. Your mouth waters instantly. You don't decide this. Your body decides it for you. But the real answer to why that happens is far stranger than cooking tastes good. It stretches back nearly 2 million years. It touches the size of your skull. It touches the shape of your gut. It may even explain why your brain runs on the fuel it runs on today. This is not a story about recipes. This is a story about survival. And it starts long before fire was ever tamed on purpose. Picture your ancestor 2 million years ago. Not quite human. Not quite ape. A creature called Homo habilis, then later Homo erectus, walking the grasslands of East Africa. Life is hard. Food is raw. Everything is chewed for hours. Raw meat is tough. Raw roots are worse. Raw plants are often full of toxins your body can barely process. Your ancestor's jaw works constantly, grinding, tearing, breaking food down bite by bite. Some estimates suggest early hominins spent over 5 hours a day just chewing. 5 hours every day, just to eat enough to survive. Now, hold that thought because it matters later. Somewhere in this harsh world, something changes. Fire enters the picture, not as a tool at first, not as an invention, as an accident. Lightning strikes dry grass. A wildfire sweeps through the savanna, and in its wake, it leaves behind something strange. Cooked meat, cooked tubers, cooked seeds. Scavenging animals would have found this. Your ancestors were scavengers too. Here's the strange part. Cooked food is easier to chew, easier to digest. It releases more calories per bite than raw food does. Your ancestor's body, always hunting for energy in a scarce world, would have noticed. Maybe not consciously, but biologically, absolutely. This is where the science gets interesting, and it starts with a man named Richard Wrangham. Wrangham is a primatologist at Harvard University. In the early 2000s, he proposed something that shook up the entire field of human evolution. He called it the cooking hypothesis. Wrangham argued that cooking wasn't just a convenience early humans stumbled into. He argued it was the single most important shift in the entire story of human evolution. More important, in some ways, than tool use. More important than walking upright. Why would something as simple as heating food change the trajectory of an entire species? Because of energy. Your brain is expensive, shockingly expensive. Even though it makes up only about 2% of your total body weight, it consumes roughly 20% of your daily energy. 20% from an organ the size of a large grapefruit. Raw food simply couldn't supply that kind of energy efficiently, not consistently, not enough to grow a brain 3 times larger than a chimpanzee's. Cooking changed the math. When you heat meat, the proteins denature. That means the tightly wound structure of the protein molecules unravels and loosens, making them easier for your digestive enzymes to break apart. When you heat starchy plants, the same thing happens to their molecular structure, making the energy inside far easier to absorb. In short, cooking is pre-digestion. It does part of the work your stomach used to have to do alone. Wrangham's research suggested this single shift could have unlocked enough extra calories to fund the growth of a bigger, hungrier brain. Not overnight, over hundreds of thousands of years. But the direction was set, and the body responded. Slowly, dramatically. Your ancestors began to change. Their jaws grew smaller, their teeth grew smaller, their guts grew shorter. That last one deserves attention. Why would evolution shrink something as important as your gut? Because a shorter gut is cheaper to maintain. Digesting raw fibrous food requires a long, energy-hungry intestinal tract, much like the one you still see in gorillas today, who spend nearly their entire waking day chewing raw plants. Cooked food needs less processing, so the body could afford to redirect that saved energy elsewhere. Where did it go? Increasingly, it went to the brain. This idea is sometimes called the expensive tissue hypothesis, developed by researchers Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler in 1995. Their argument was elegant. The body has a limited energy budget. If one organ grows, another organ often has to shrink to pay for it. In humans, the gut shrank. The brain grew. Cooking, in this view, didn't just make food taste better. It renegotiated the entire energy budget of the human body. Isn't it strange to think your intelligence might be partly a side effect of dinner? But there's another layer to this story, and it's less about biology and more about behavior. Something happened around the campfire that changed the social structure of early humans entirely. Think about it from a purely practical standpoint. Raw food can be eaten anywhere, anytime, alone, while foraging. Cooked food requires something raw food never demanded: a fire, a place, a gathering point. Suddenly, eating wasn't a solitary act performed on the move. It became an event, a shared moment. People had to bring food back to a central location. They had to wait for it to cook. They had to sit together while it did. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, who studied hunter-gatherer societies, including the Yuhansi of the Kalahari, found something revealing about fire-like conversation. During the day, conversations tended to focus on practical matters: complaints, logistics, conflict. But at night around the fire, conversations shifted, stories emerged, myths, jokes, social bonding. Fire didn't just cook food, it created the world's first social hour. This matters more than it might seem. Language, cooperation, and shared culture are often considered defining traits of humanity. And here's a shared physical space, born out of the practical need to cook food, that may have become one of the earliest incubators for exactly those traits. Could the origin of storytelling be sitting quietly inside a cooking fire? Now here's the counterintuitive twist. For decades, many scientists assumed the sequence went like this. Humans got smart first and then figured out how to cook: intelligence. In this telling was the cause. Cooking was simply one of intelligence's many clever inventions. But Wrangham's hypothesis flips that order entirely. He argues cooking came first, and intelligence followed as a consequence. Fueled by the extra calories, cooking unlocked. In other words, your ancestors didn't become smart and then start cooking. They started cooking, and it made them smarter. This is a profound reversal. It means one of the most cultural things humans do, transforming raw ingredients through fire, might actually be one of the most biologically foundational things humans do. Not decoration on top of intelligence, a driver of it. Of course, this hypothesis isn't without controversy. Finding direct archaeological evidence of controlled fire from nearly 2 million years ago is extraordinarily difficult. Fire leaves faint traces. Ash scatters, charcoal decomposes. Sites erode over hundreds of thousands of years. The clearest, most widely accepted evidence for controlled fire use comes from a site called Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, where researchers led by archaeologist Francesco Berna found burned bone fragments and ash residues dated to around 1 million years ago. That's solid evidence. But it's younger than the 2 million year timeline Wrangham's hypothesis requires for cooking to explain the earliest brain growth in Homo erectus. So a gap exists, a real one. Some researchers believe cooking became widespread and habitual later than Wrangham proposes, perhaps around 400 to 500,000 years ago, rather than being present at the very origin of Homo erectus. Does that mean the cooking hypothesis is wrong? Not necessarily. It means the story is still being written. Even critics of the exact timeline generally agree on the core mechanism. Cooked food provides more usable energy than raw food, and that energy surplus mattered enormously for a species evolving a larger brain. The debate isn't about whether cooking helped, it's about precisely when it started helping and how much of the story it explains alone. Either way, something remarkable remains true. At some point, your ancestors crossed a threshold no other species on Earth has crossed in quite the same way. They began transforming their food before eating it, not just preparing it, fundamentally changing its chemistry, its texture, its nutritional yield using controlled fire. No other primate does this. Chimpanzees, humanity's closest living relatives, have never been observed to cook, even though some have been taught to understand the general concept in captivity, as shown in research by psychologists Felix Warneken and Alexandra Rosati. Chimpanzees can grasp that cooking transforms food. They can even wait patiently for food to cook in an experimental device. But in the wild, they never do it themselves. Why not? They lack sustained control over fire. They lack the patience-driven planning required to gather food, transport it, wait through the cooking process, and only then eat. That waiting is not a small thing. It requires a kind of delayed gratification that may itself be deeply tied to the cognitive leap cooking helped fund in the first place. In other words, cooking may have required a slightly smarter brain to begin with, and then made brains smarter still. A feedback loop, a slow-motion snowball rolling across nearly 2 million years. Now bring this back to you. Back to that smell drifting from a kitchen or a grill or a street vendor's cart. That instinctive mouth-watering response, it isn't random. It isn't simply cultural conditioning from childhood memories. It is ancient. It is wired into a nervous system shaped by a 2 million-year relationship between your species and fire. Your modern brain, the one reading these words, forming complex thoughts, understanding abstract history, running background calculations about grocery lists and work emails, exists partly because your ancestors learned to unlock extra calories from a burning branch. Consider the modern kitchen for a moment. It is, in a very real sense, a technological descendant of that first accidental campfire. The oven that bakes bread, the stove that sears meat, the microwave that heats leftovers in 90 seconds. Every single one of these devices exists to do exactly what fire first did for Homo erectus: pre-digest food, unlock its energy, make it easier for the body to use. You might think of cooking as a modern convenience, something invented by chefs, refined by culture, elevated into cuisine. But underneath all of that sits the same ancient biological transaction. Heat breaks bonds. Broken bonds release energy. Released energy built the brain, currently reading this sentence and deciding whether to agree with it. There's something almost humbling in that. Something that connects a Tuesday night dinner to a hominin crouched beside a wildfire 1 million years ago. Watching, waiting, learning that the burned meat tasted somehow better, somehow easier, somehow more. And here's a thought worth sitting with. The social rituals you associate with food today, family dinners, holiday feasts, the simple act of sharing a meal with someone you care about, may trace their roots directly back to those first fires. Back to the moment eating stopped being a solitary, grab-and-go act and became something people did together, waiting, talking, bonding, while dinner slowly cooked. Every dinner table conversation you've ever had may be, in some quiet evolutionary sense, an echo of a much older gathering. A gathering lit by flame instead of electric light. A gathering where the first stories, the first jokes, the first shared silences of the human species may have taken shape. So the next time you smell something roasting and your mouth waters before your mind even catches up, remember what that reaction really is. It is not just hunger. It is not just habit. It is memory. Ancient, wordless, cellular memory. A signal passed down through hundreds of thousands of generations, tracing back to the first ancestor who learned that fire could turn hard, raw, barely edible food into something that fed not just the body, but eventually the mind itself. You smell it before you see it. Something is roasting. Your mouth waters instantly, and now you know exactly why.